Tonight we wander into the misty hills and low stone huts of medieval Wales, a place where sheep outnumber people, the rain never quite stops, and, oddly enough, the law is obsessed with cheese. You're not dreaming. You're just lying there, warm under the covers, and suddenly, you're barefoot on a muddy path, the smell of wet wool in the air, as you try to understand why someone might get fined for stealing a cheese wheel, or for pressing one without the right social rank. Somewhere, a dog barks. A cow moos. And you, poor traveler, are about to fall headfirst into a legal system where dairy products hold more power than most peasants ever will. You probably won't survive this unless you're on very good terms with a milkmaid. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it in your part of the world? Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward. It's around the 10th century, and you're somewhere between mountains and marshes, cloaked in mist. The sheep bleat like they know something you don't. The village ahead smells like wet rushes, wood smoke, and milk turned to magic. At the heart of this world isn't the sword or even the crown, it's the law. Specifically, Cyfraith Hywel, or the laws of Hywel Dda. King Hywel the Good, as they called him, though no one asked the people who had to pay his taxes, was a 10th century Welsh ruler famous for codifying native laws. And these laws, once you peek into them, are astonishingly detailed, bizarrely specific, and deeply obsessed with cheese. Picture this. You're a village woman with 2 cows. You wake before dawn, fingers stiff with cold, to milk them. That milk. The basis for soft white curds. Those curds. The path to pressed cheese. That cheese. Legally protected, valued, taxed, and even weaponized in arguments. That's the world you're in now. It might seem funny to us, lying comfortably in bed, thinking about cheese with our biggest concern being whether we left the fridge door open. But back then, cheese was life. It preserved milk, it stored energy, and since refrigeration was just a far-off wizard's dream, it was a miracle of controlled rot. So naturally, the law got involved. Now imagine walking into a hut where the hearth glows low and the walls are covered with soot and prayers. There's a wooden shelf along the side, and on it, not books, not swords, cheese. And not just any cheese. Carefully arranged, categorized, labeled by age, texture, and value. You wouldn't want to put the wrong cheese on the table for a visiting lord. That could literally be illegal. The laws of Hywel were memorized and recited by professional legal scholars called singors, and these guys took cheese more seriously than your lactose-intolerant cousin at a fondue party. According to the laws, different kinds of cheese had different legal statuses. A soft, fresh cheese made the same morning might be considered common fare, almost beneath legal notice. But a matured, pressed cheese that had weight, value, status, and legal consequences if stolen, misused, or even served inappropriately. Here's where it gets fun. Let's say someone stole your goat. That's bad, obviously. But what if they stole your goat and the cheese she helped produce? That's worse. Cheese becomes part of the crime. And if someone injured your servant and you needed compensation, the law might say you were owed something like 3 shillings and, wait for it, 2 wheels of cheese. It sounds absurd, right? Like a dairy-themed RPG. But remember, in a world where coin was rare and livestock was wealth, cheese was the edible currency of rural life. It was portable, valuable, and unlike livestock, wouldn't wander off while you were sleeping. Historians still argue whether the obsessive detail in Welsh dairy laws was a reflection of local custom, or a deliberate political move by Hywel to knit together disparate regions with something everyone could agree on, their shared love of really good cheese. And if you think this is just some dusty parchment nonsense, remember that these laws weren't just for show. They were enforced. A cheese-related case might be judged at the village court, with compensation measured in actual dairy weight. You might be ordered to deliver a specific cheese to your wronged neighbor, soft, round, unsalted, weighing no less than 1 pound. Get it wrong, and you're in deeper legal trouble. Forget your Netflix password? That's annoying. Misweigh your cheese? That's a misdemeanor. One law even lays out the correct amount of cheese to be given as hospitality by a villein, basically a low-ranking farmer, to his lord. Too much, and you're trying too hard. Too little, and you're disrespecting the natural order. Cheese was balance. Cheese was structure. Cheese was borderline terrifying. You stumble back out into the night air, the stars sharp above the hills. Somewhere, an owl hoots, and you suddenly remember, didn't the law also dictate how long cheese should be aged before being considered lawful? You're pretty sure it did. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. Probably laugh. Quietly. Through the nose. Here's a quirky bit. Welsh law also distinguished between cheese made in private households and that made communally, especially during seasonal festivals. The communal cheese. It had its own legal flavor. A kind of dairy democracy. If your curds contributed to the wheel, you got a say in how it was divided. If not, tough way. And so you drift along in this strange, deeply bureaucratic countryside, where your value might literally be calculated in cow milk conversion ratios. You're starting to get it now. Cheese wasn't just food, it was status, justice, and social glue. Sticky, slightly funky social glue. Just wait until you find out what happens when someone presses cheese without permission. That's coming. But for now, the sheep bleat, the fire flickers, and you keep walking, deeper into a world where the law is old, the sky is heavy, and the dairy is divine. You wake to the soft thump of hooves and the creak of leather straps. Dawn rolls over the hills like warm honey, and someone's shouting about morning curds. You're no longer just an observer, you're now in the orbit of one of the most fascinating documents in Welsh history, the laws of Hywel Dda. And this time, you're trying to read them. You sit on a stool made from a stump, staring at a parchment laid out on a low oak table, ink smudged by time and thumbs. The script is neat, careful, but dense. You squint, trying to piece it together. Somewhere between the parts about blood feuds and livestock are rules about cheese. Pages of them. They're tucked between inheritance rights and legal procedures for divorce, which feels somehow deeply correct. These laws weren't invented by Hywel Dda, by the way. He compiled and codified them around the year 945, bringing together centuries of oral tradition and localized rulings into one semi-coherent package. He probably didn't write them himself, he had legal scholars, bards of the bench, if you will, but he gets the credit. Branding is everything, even in medieval governance. Now, to your modern mind, it's easy to assume a law code would focus on land ownership or noble disputes. But the Welsh had other priorities. Because while land might shift hands in war, cheese stayed loyal. Unless it molded. Which is its own legal issue. We'll get there. One of the first things you notice as you peer closer is how much importance the law places on household production. And not just the result cheese, but the process. There are clauses outlining when milk becomes legally owned property. There are rules about curdling. There are instructions on when rennet may be added and who gets to decide how it's stirred. It reads like a cross between legal code and a recipe, with a dash of melodrama. You read, if a person take milk not his, and curdle it without leave, let him pay its worth and the curdled cheese besides. Yes, there is a legal difference between curdling someone else's milk accidentally versus intentionally. The law is clear, intent matters. And if you mess with the rennet without permission, you're basically medieval public enemy number one. And it gets more granular. The law outlines not only the penalty for theft of cheese, but also misuse of cheese. Store it improperly? That's on you. Press it in an unauthorized mold. You may owe your neighbor 2 days' worth of labor. One wrong wheel, and boom, you're digging ditches. There's also a fascinating social commentary baked right in. Cheese appears in multiple sections about compensation and value equivalence. It is a known quantity. So if someone breaks your fence, they owe you labor or cheese. If someone insults your honor, well, the laws are a little vague there, but cheese often ends up on the table. Quite literally. And get this, there's even a clause for loss of cheese due to supernatural means. One law mentions that if a spirit or unknown hand steals or ruins the curds during the night, the loss is shared communally, unless negligence can be proven. Historians still argue whether this was meant to protect against theft, or just mischievous cats. This level of legal dairy detail isn't just quirky, it reflects how central cheese was to daily life and survival. Grain could be taxed. Animals could be traded. But cheese was personal. It was tied to the rhythms of home and field, to seasons, to health, to fertility even. In a way, it was the edible calendar of Welsh rural existence. You press your fingers to the parchment. The ink still whispers stories. Cheese isn't mentioned in passing, it's structured into the very framework of governance. It holds a place just beneath the sacred and just above the mundane. If that sounds melodramatic, remember, this is a world where you could barter your way out of jail with the right kind of cheddar. Literally. One fragment, barely legible, catches your eye. It reads, "Let the cheese of the hearth be the woman's to keep." Not the man's, the woman's. And this is where the law gets sneakily progressive. Because even in a deeply patriarchal world, women held recognized rights over household dairy. They controlled the process, and often the profit. Cheese was female territory. Milkmaids weren't just charming village figures, they were powerful producers, legally backed, with their own claims to property and recompense. And that hearth cheese. It wasn't just food. It was legal evidence. In disputes over domestic theft, cheese could be brought as proof, marked, weighed, even tasted in court. Imagine a judge holding up a wedge, sniffing it, then nodding gravely. Yes. Clearly, the defendant stole this. It smells of Glyn Valley thyme. Now, not every cheese mention in the code is serious. There are some downright peculiar ones. One clause says that if a traveler vomits from spoiled cheese given at a feast, the host owes double restitution. But only if the cheese was more than a week old. Because apparently, a 6-day-old cheese-induced illness? That's on you. And that's another odd historical footnote: aging mattered. Cheese had to mature the proper amount of time to be considered legitimate. Serve it too early and you could be mocked, fined, or seen as suspiciously poor. This wasn't a dinner party faux pas, it was a socio-economic red flag. People could climb or fall down the respect ladder based on their aging technique. The scribes didn't joke around, either. Cheese was itemized in some copies of the law with detailed illustrations showing ideal shape and weight. We're talking diagrams that look like IKEA instructions for cheese wheels. And the punishments? Consistent. A wheel stolen from a noble's pantry might cost you a month's labor. One taken from a commoner's shelf? Still bad, but maybe just a stiff lecture and some restorative gift cheese. And in case you thought this was a uniquely Welsh quirk, nope. Contemporary Irish and Breton laws had similar dairy obsessions, though nowhere near the granularity of Welsh code. Welsh laws practically micromanaged your cheese board. So you lean back now, your mind a little blurry from all the legal lactose. The laws of Hwel weren't quirky footnotes in some medieval journal, they were the operating system of a society that ran on curds and common sense. And tonight, you're not just drifting into history. You're curling up inside it, wrapped in parchment, cows outside, a wheel of justice slowly aging in the cellar. Don't sleep yet. There's more curdled bureaucracy coming. Your feet are sore from all this time traveling. Stone paths are not kind to modern arches, but you press on. You've wandered into a village gathering, a place where cows outnumber teeth and the evening smells like wet hay and roasting turnips. There's music, someone humming tunelessly, and in the middle of it all, a table. Not a banquet table. No meat, no mead, no gilded dishes. Just cheese. 7 wheels, perfectly arranged like a dairy Stonehenge. And suddenly, the hierarchy becomes visible. This isn't just a cheese tasting. This is a social map in edible form. You reach out to touch one, a firm, pressed cheese with a neat, fluted edge, and your hand is gently slapped away by a man whose hat says don't. The cheese is for the reeve, he tells you. That's the local official, kind of like a medieval HOA president crossed with a tax auditor. That cheese. Out of your league. Because in medieval Wales, every curd has a class. Let's break it down. According to the laws of Hywel Dda, the quality, age, and even shape of a cheese were not just matters of taste, they were matters of rank. A peasant didn't just eat lower quality cheese, they were legally forbidden from producing the higher tier stuff in some areas. It wasn't just about what you could afford, it was what you were allowed to eat. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were rigidly enforced or more symbolic, but the intent is clear: cheese mirrored the social order. Pressed cheese, the kind that required time, weight, and proper tools, was a status item. It suggested not only wealth, but leisure. Only someone with land, cattle, and a servant or two could afford to wait weeks for a wheel to mature. You, a humble wanderer, are offered a small lump of soft cheese from a cloth. It's tangy, a little sour, unpressed and fresh, what they call cors laeth, milk cheese. It's made and eaten within a day or two, and it's the standard peasant fare. It's what people make in the corner of a smoky room, using whatever milk the cows didn't kick over that morning. Pressed cheese. That's cors caled, hard cheese. It requires labor, tools, and time. And legally, it's tied to rank. If you're a eucalyptus, a nobleman, you're entitled to pressed cheese in both gift and hospitality. If you're a Tyog, or Verlaine, basically a non-free farmer, you make do with the soft stuff, unless it's your lord's feast day and you're sneaking scraps off the kitchen table. You walk with the reeve a while, and he explains that pressed cheese has ceremonial weight. It's given at births, funerals, and as part of legal settlements. You don't press cheese for fun. You press it for honor. This creates all kinds of social weirdness. For instance, let's say you're a free woman with a cow of your own. You've somehow managed to press a beautiful wheel of cheese in secret, maybe using a family stone press passed down through generations. But the law says that cheese of this quality must be declared and taxed accordingly. If it turns out you're producing noble-grade dairy without a noble's title, that's not just cheeky, it's subversive. It threatens the food chain in every sense. So what happens? Someone reports you. Maybe a jealous neighbor. Maybe that nosy cousin who's always sniffing around your pantry. A local court is convened. And the cheese, your cheese, is brought in as evidence. It's weighed, smelled, sliced, and possibly judged harder than most wedding feasts. If deemed too fine for your station, you maybe find yourself, or forced to surrender your beautiful wheel to the Lord's household. Let that sink in. You can be too good at cheese, legally speaking. It wasn't just flavor, either. Even the shape and size mattered. One clause in the laws describes the ideal dimensions of a feast-worthy wheel, not less than a hand's width in girth, nor more than a day's slice from the center. That's right. You could break the law just by cutting it wrong. The cheese itself becomes performative. In the great halls of Welsh nobility, presenting the correct cheese in the correct way to the correct person at the correct time could elevate your status or destroy your reputation. Bring soft curds to a funeral? You're disrespecting the dead. Bring hard cheese to a baby's naming ceremony? What are you, made of stone? There's even a rule, though some scholars say it may have been more folklore than formal statute, that certain cheeses should only be served by specific hands. Like, if you're a certain social rank, you're not even allowed to touch the knife that cuts a noble's cheese. Talk about sharp class lines. And yet, all these complexities made sense in their time. Cheese was a luxury good and a staple food. It was both everyday survival and elevated gift. It didn't just sit in your pantry, it sat at the heart of who you were. What you were worth. What others thought you deserved. Now here's a quirky detail. Some regional customs gave cheese nicknames that reflected social rank. A common one, Y. Breenan Bark, or the Little King, for a particularly round, firm wheel served only at midsummer feasts. Another, F-wort, a joking term for lumpy, sour cheese given to debtors or people who insulted the cook. So yes, cheese could be petty. And of course, nothing about this was universal. The laws varied slightly by region, and enforcement often depended on the mood of the local judge, the standing of the families involved, and probably how good the cheese actually tasted. Still, the fact remains, cheese in medieval Wales was never just cheese. It was class, caste, and culture, bound into one pungent, beautiful wheel. You sit now beside a peat fire, watching someone slice a small triangle of sharp, crumbly white cheese and place it reverently on a reed mat. No one speaks. You all just chew in silence, aware on some ancient, cellular level that this bite of cheese carries weight. It carries the law. You're beginning to suspect that the Welsh legal code was one part statute, one part dairy poetry, and one part social minefield. And your place in this curdled cosmos? Still very much undecided. But don't worry. You've got time. As long as you don't press anything you shouldn't. You're starting to accept it now, this world where legal documents come with side notes about rennet, and where courtroom drama might hinge on whether a will was aged or merely forgotten. Tonight, your bed is made of hay and your pillow smells faintly of ewe's milk. You dream in lactose. Let's lean into something trickier now, enforcement. Because rules about cheese might sound charming, but in medieval Wales, they weren't suggestions, they were binding. And someone had to make sure no one was cheating the cheese system. That someone, usually a combination of local singorst, or lawmen, and neighborhood nosy parkers who really enjoyed knowing everyone else's business. You're standing in a cramped village court, one of those wooden longhouses with soot on the ceiling and a dog asleep under the bench. There's a dispute brewing. A woman, barefoot, fierce-eyed, accuses her neighbor of cheese dilution. She says he sold a wheel as pressed cow's milk cheese, but it's mostly goat, and barely pressed at all. In modern terms, this is a lawsuit over cheese fraud. But here, it's more like breach of social trust and legal trespass. The local judge, a man with a moustache like a broom and a tunic he's clearly slept in, nods gravely. He orders the cheese brought forward. A boy runs out and returns with the wheel, already sliced open like a cheese autopsy. Everyone leans in. A sniff. A prod. Someone mutters, "Too soft. Too new." Here's the thing. The Welsh laws didn't just regulate who could make what cheese. They also laid out how it must be made, how long it should age, even the type of milk required depending on who it was for. Goat's milk for certain ritual uses. Cow's milk for general trade. And sheep's milk. That one sparks debate. Historians still argue whether sheep's milk cheese was considered inferior, or simply more regional and rare. The law calls for honesty in dairy trade. If you say it's pressed cheese, it must be. If you say it's cow's milk, no goats allowed. Misrepresent your cheese. That's a breach of hospitality, a legal category all its own. It's not just false advertising. It's dishonor. This is where the cheese inspectors come in. Yes, really. The legal term was closer to market reeve or food tithing man, but their job often included inspecting cheeses for quality, weight, and truthfulness. Imagine the medieval version of the FDA, except you have to pay them in eggs and they sometimes bring their cousin along for a second opinion. Your guide, let's call her Gwen, explains it like this. You cheat the scales on meat, someone might get sick. But cheat cheese. You're insulting the cow, the craft, and the law. There's a moment in the court when the judge calls for sworn tasting. That's right. He chooses 3 men, reputed to have honest tongues, and has them each taste a slice and give testimony. Their verdict: sour, slack-bodied, dishonest. Not the man, the cheese. The penalty: 2 more cheeses paid to the woman, 1 to the court, and a public apology. And no cheese sales for a month. This kind of enforcement wasn't limited to markets. Feasts were also prime grounds for cheese scandal. Nobles might receive tribute wheels that don't meet expectations. If that cheese was too small, or too young, or, heaven forbid, moldy on arrival, the sender could face fines or lose favor for the year. And remember, favor was currency. There's even a case mentioned in the Red Book of Hergest, an enormous medieval Welsh manuscript, that implies a dispute between 2 abbeys over which had delivered the more honorable cheese gift to a bishop. The bishop, it seems, diplomatically ate both and said nothing. But the abbeys continued their dairy cold war for a decade. One strange legal clause suggests that if a dog eats a cheese meant for tribute before it's delivered, the responsibility still falls on the person who made it. You're legally liable unless you can prove the dog belonged to someone else and was trained to eat cheese. This, naturally, leads to an entire subfield of debate among legal historians, who wonder whether cheese theft by animals was more common than we think. You imagine small, nimble hounds trained to sniff out high-end wheels and wonder if the whole village wasn't secretly part of a cheese cartel. Of course, not every dispute ended in court. Often, enforcement came in the form of community shaming. If someone consistently made bad cheese or passed off lesser wheels as noble fare, they might find themselves the subject of songs, jokes, or worse, ignored during feast toasts. That's the social death sentence in this world. There's even a game children played, sort of a medieval hopscotch, called Chwarae'r Gors or Turn the Cheese, which may have started as a mockery of a local cheesemaker whose wheels always leaned to one side. Imagine a 7-year-old laughing at your faulty curds for the next 30 years. Emotional damage inflicted. Still, not all enforcement was punitive. There were legal protections, too, especially for women. In many Welsh communities, women were the primary cheesemakers, and the law acknowledged their skill as both labor and property. If a man tried to claim his wife's cheese as part of his own estate after a separation, she could appeal under Cyfraith y Mercht, or women's law. And if her cheese had won praise or tribute rights, it might increase her bride price in a future marriage. Historians still argue whether this empowerment was widespread or more idealized in the legal texts than in practice. But the laws mention it enough to suggest that cheese was one of the few crafts where a woman's skill translated into legal leverage. Tonight, you sit by a stream, the moon casting silver light on the water, and nibble a tiny chunk of nutty, crumbly cheese wrapped in rushes. You think about all the hands that touched it, milked the cow, stirred the curds, pressed the wheel, turned it every few days with care and intention. You think about the people who would have defended this cheese in court. Who would have tasted it, debated it, sworn by it. It's not just food. It's a legal artifact. And in a world where a misjudged will could cost you a year's trade, where tasting cheese was part of your civic duty, and where even dogs might be tried for dairy theft, you start to get it. You respect the cheese. You roll over in your sleep, the sound of sheep bells faint in the distance, the scent of smoke and damp wood lingering in the folds of your imaginary blanket. Tonight, the dream continues deeper, not just into the cheese itself, but into who owned it, who made it, and what those roles revealed about the way people lived and moved through their tightly woven, mud and honey world. It's time to talk about inheritance, and yes, cheese was involved. Because in medieval Wales, your dairy wasn't just lunch, it was legacy. Picture a longhouse, maybe a bit drafty, with timber walls darkened by generations of fire and steam. A woman is dying. Her children and grandchildren are gathered. A few neighbors, too nosy but quiet. They've come to witness the will, though wills here aren't written, they're spoken. Recited. Repeated. Memory serves as your notary, and anyone present becomes a future witness to the truth. As her voice fades, the woman names her possessions. A carved comb. 2 hanks of spun wool. And then, the 3 wheels of summer cheese, still turning in the back room, those are for Gwen. Not Gwen the daughter, mind you. Gwen the niece. Because inheritance could skip around in ways that made emotional sense, even if the law had other ideas. You sit by the hearth and watch as these simple gifts are divided not by gold or coin, but by functional wealth. And in this case, the cheese matters. Because it was hers, curdled by her hands, pressed in her own carved mold, rubbed in salt and turned every few days in the smoke-warmed pantry. It bears her imprint, not just literally, some families had their own sigils to mark the rind, but spiritually. It's her skill, embodied. Her flavor, encoded. And this is where things get even more fascinating. According to certain laws, cheese could be inherited with special conditions. For example, if the wheel was made before a death and not consumed, its ownership passed intact to the heir even if it was stored in the home of someone else. Property by curd proximity? Kind of. The law had language for this. Worth y cause, the worth of the cheese. And that worth had to be honored. If someone stole or consumed a cheese before inheritance was legally finalized, that was considered a theft of goods pending division, a crime with its own unique set of punishments, often involving restitution plus public shame. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of cheese in these laws was symbolic, or whether it points to a wider practice of fermented goods being used to hold value during transition times, births, deaths, marriages. After all, cheese was one of the few things you could tuck away and know would likely improve, rather than decay, as seasons passed. There's a fragment in the laws of Huel Dada, buried between passages on land borders and sheep penalties, that notes, if a man dies and his cheese is not divided, let it be known the eldest son may take the 2 best wheels, and the rest shall go to the wife or the second kin. It's dry legalese. But imagine being the second son and eyeing that 3rd wheel like it holds your future happiness. Because sometimes, it did. This was even more complex in monastic communities, where cheese was often communal but still tracked by contributor. You might have Brother Cadfan's cheese, Brother Mila's cheese, and the abbot's special salted round all aging in the same cellar, but with distinct rights attached. If Cadfan passed away before Lent, and his cheese hadn't been eaten, it might be given to his surviving family as part of his worldly goods, or, depending on his vows, given to the poor. The point is, cheese wasn't a throwaway asset. It had identity. And the law took it seriously. Sometimes it wasn't just the cheese, but the tools associated with it that passed hands. The press itself. The heavy stone used for weight. The carved wooden molds. All of them carried not just practical function but symbolic power. Owning your mother's cheese mold was like inheriting her songbook or her loom, except here, it made food, fortune, and the occasional tax payment. In certain districts, cheese molds were engraved, almost like tombstones, with swirls and spirals that identified a family's style. Not quite a brand, but close. If a neighbor used your design without permission, you had cause to bring a claim of misrepresentation. Not quite copyright infringement. More like dairy forgery. And here's a juicy tidbit. Wheels of cheese were sometimes buried. Not metaphorically, literally. Especially in times of war or plague, when families fled homes or expected looters, they would bury wrapped cheeses in marked spots behind houses or under barns. Some of these buried wheels were later dug up and claimed by descendants, with arguments over rightful ownership lasting years. One poetic story tells of a woman who left behind a single buried wheel and no other wealth. Decades later, her granddaughter unearthed it and traded it for a milk cow and 2 cloaks, rebuilding the family's fortunes from that one, long-forgotten curd. Was it real? Hard to say. But cheese lore doesn't need hard proof. It just needs enough salt to preserve belief. And perhaps the most poignant detail, certain funeral rites in the far western reaches of Wales included placing a small cheese wheel with the body, especially if the deceased had been a cheesemaker. It wasn't just tribute. It was evidence that this person had worked, produced, crafted something from the living world. That even now, as the soul traveled, their hands had fed others. You imagine one such burial, a quiet glen, mist curling around standing stones, and a small wheel tucked beside the headstone. It won't last forever. But for now, it rests there, silent. A final, soft offering to the world. So the next time someone leaves you a block of cheese in their will, don't laugh. It might be the most meaningful thing they owned. The world outside your imagined cottage darkens further, the wind slipping gently through the thatch. You hear the distant clink of wooden pails and the low hum of cows settling in for the night. In your half-sleep, the cheese itself seems to hum too, a quiet, bloomy note of history unfolding. Tonight, you follow the cheese beyond the home, past inheritance, into the bustling heart of the marketplace where wheels turned not just for flavor, but for profit. It's early morning in a Welsh town. Let's say it's Carmarthen. The fog still clings to the cobbles like a lazy cat, and already, sellers are setting up shop under rough canvas awnings. You walk slowly through the crowd. Your breath fogs. Your feet crunch frost. And the smell? It's unforgettable: wet wool, honey cakes, peat smoke, and cheese. Always cheese. Not just one kind. Oh no. There's a tidy pile of pressed cow's milk rounds, dense and waxed. A leaner stack of tangier goat's cheese, wrapped in damp linen and marked with a curled feather. And then, a wedge of sharp, dry sheep's cheese with a bark rind and a warning glare from the stall keeper. That's not for sampling. You lean in. Ask the price. He says, 3 eggs, or half a mutton haunch. But don't try to pay with silver, you're not buying imported spices here. This is the heart of the barter economy. Cheese was currency. Legal, traceable, haggled over currency. And there were rules. So many rules. First, weights and measures. Under Welsh law, a cheese sold in the market had to be of honest weight, or the vendor could be fined, or worse, banned from trading for an entire season. A market reeve would go stall to stall with a heavy scale, a set of carved stones as reference. Any seller found short-changing customers could be subject to a public scolding, and sometimes made to give away free cheese for a day to make amends. Sound humiliating? It was meant to be. Cheese was tied directly to your reputation, especially in smaller towns. No one wants to buy from the guy who skimps on curds or adds too much salt to disguise a weak ferment. One particularly fun clause in the law notes that shoulda will be swollen with wind, a polite way of saying it's gone gassy and rotten, let it be cut at once, and if foul within, let the maker wear the rind round his neck till sunset. Yes. Cheese shame necklace. Delightful. Historians still argue whether these rules were enforced consistently or more for dramatic effect, but evidence from surviving legal manuscripts and poems suggests they were taken very seriously, at least in towns where cheese was a major trade item. Some districts even required vendor licenses, renewed annually with proof of production. That's right, you had to earn the right to sell your cheese, and some sellers were even tested in front of a panel of elders before being granted a stall. Of course, cheese didn't move through towns by magic. This is where the cheese routes come in: informal but consistent trade pathways along rivers, over hill passes, and through woodland trails, where goods moved from isolated farms into clustered towns. Cheese was ideal for this, being light, durable, and long-lasting compared to fresh milk. Some families specialized in cheese transport. You picture a bent old man named Emrys, leading a donkey laden with wheels wrapped in straw. Each week, he treks 15 miles from valley to market, his pack creaking, his boots squelching. He trades cheese for dried fish, oats, candles, then brings those back to the farmers. Emrys doesn't need to write anything down. The routes are memorized. The debts are logged in the mind. But if something goes wrong, a stolen wheel, a spoiled batch, the law gets involved. There's even a provision in some regions that if a cheese carrier dies mid-journey, the goods must be returned to the original maker unless there's proof of completed trade. Like a signed promissory oath. Or a bite mark matching a witness's description. Seriously. Cheese could also serve as tax payment. This is where things get spicy. Under Welsh law, landowners and tenants alike might owe dues to their lords, abbots, or kings, and not just in coin. A specified number of cheese wheels per season was a common requirement, especially during the summer and autumn months. It was called a cheese render, and it was taken as seriously as a military levy. Fail to deliver? You might face fines, loss of grazing rights, or public embarrassment. Deliver too much, like a surprise gift of extra wheels? Now that was a political move. An attempt to gain favor. Sometimes, cheese was the medieval version of schmoozing. One delicious story buried in a 13th century tract describes a minor noble trying to gain a bishop's favor by delivering a cartload of aged cheese without worms or lies. The phrase makes you smile. You imagine the bishop sniffing the gift, nodding once, and granting a tiny land lease extension. Cheese diplomacy, subtle but effective. This tax-based system also meant that cheese sometimes backed up in storage. Monasteries might end up with too many wheels to eat, leading to charitable distributions or trade with traveling merchants. These surplus cheeses, often still marked with a maker's stamp, wound up in taverns, ships, or even foreign ports, spreading Welsh flavors far beyond their origins. And yes, there's a quirky outlier here: smuggled cheese. Certain cheese types, especially flavored or herb-studded varieties, were technically illegal to sell in some markets without permission. The reasoning? They were considered medicinal or ritually distinct. But people love loopholes. So some traders hid their spicy wheels under layers of plain curds, hoping the market reeve wouldn't slice too deep. You can almost see it, a cloaked figure slipping a pungent, pepper-laced wedge into a monk's satchel, whispering, "For your digestion, father." The monk nods. The cheese disappears. Even today, some cheese styles associated with Wales show trace evidence of those early black market trades: odd flavorings, ash-dusted rinds, herbal stripes no one can quite explain. Leftovers from a world where selling the wrong cheese in the wrong place might get you fined, flogged, or just very politely exiled from the cheese guild. Yes, there were cheese guilds. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You leave the market now, your basket full, your hands cold, your heart oddly full. You've seen cheese traded like coin, defended like kin, and judged like gold. You've watched laws rise and fall around humble wheels wrapped in linen. And you're only halfway through the tale. The world outside your imagined cottage darkens further, the wind slipping gently through the thatch. You hear the distant clink of wooden pails and the low hum of cows settling in for the night. In your half-sleep, the cheese itself seems to hum too, a quiet, bloomy note of history unfolding. Tonight, you follow the cheese beyond the home, past inheritance, into the bustling heart of the marketplace, where wheels turned not just for flavor, but for profit. It's early morning in a Welsh town. Let's say it's Carmarthen. The fog still clings to the cobbles like a lazy cat, and already, sellers are setting up shop under rough canvas awnings. You walk slowly through the crowd. Your breath fogs. Your feet crunch frost. And the smell? It's unforgettable: wet wool, honey cakes, peat smoke, and cheese. Always cheese. Not just one kind. Oh no. There's a tidy pile of pressed cow's milk rounds, dense and waxed. A leaner stack of tangier goat's cheese, wrapped in damp linen and marked with a curled feather. And then, a wedge of sharp, dry sheep's cheese with a bark rind and a warning glare from the stall-keeper. That's not for sampling. You lean in. Ask the price. He says, 3 eggs, or half a mutton haunch. But don't try to pay with silver, you're not buying imported spices here. This is the heart of the barter economy. Cheese was currency. Legal, traceable, haggled over currency. And there were rules. So many rules. First, weights and measures. Under Welsh law, a cheese sold in the market had to be of honest weight, or the vendor could be fined, or worse, banned from trading for an entire season. A market reeve would go stall to stall with a heavy scale, a set of carved stones as reference. Any seller found short-changing customers could be subject to a public scolding, and sometimes made to give away free cheese for a day to make amends. Sound humiliating? It was meant to be. Cheese was tied directly to your reputation, especially in smaller towns. No one wants to buy from the guy who skimps on curds or adds too much salt to disguise a weak ferment. One particularly fun clause in the law notes that shoulda will be swollen with wind, a polite way of saying it's gone gassy and rotten: let it be cut at once, and if foul within, let the maker wear the rind round his neck till sunset. Yes. Cheese shame necklace. Delightful. Historians still argue whether these rules were enforced consistently or more for dramatic effect, but evidence from surviving legal manuscripts and poems suggests they were taken very seriously, at least in towns where cheese was a major trade item. Some districts even required vendor licenses, renewed annually with proof of production. That's right, you had to earn the right to sell your cheese, and some sellers were even tested in front of a panel of elders before being granted a stall. Of course, cheese didn't move through towns by magic. This is where the cheese routes come in: informal but consistent trade pathways along rivers, over hill passes, and through woodland trails, where goods moved from isolated farms into clustered towns. Cheese was ideal for this, being light, durable, and long-lasting compared to fresh milk. Some families specialized in cheese transport. You picture a bent old man named Emrys, leading a donkey laden with wheels wrapped in straw. Each week, he treks 15 miles from valley to market, his pack creaking, his boots squelching. He trades cheese for dried fish, oats, candles, then brings those back to the farmers. Emrys doesn't need to write anything down. The routes are memorized. The debts are logged in the mind. But if something goes wrong, a stolen wheel, a spoiled batch, the law gets involved. There's even a provision in some regions that if a cheese carrier dies mid-journey, the goods must be returned to the original maker unless there's proof of completed trade. Like a signed promissory oath. Or a bite mark matching a witness's description. Seriously. Cheese could also serve as tax payment. This is where things get spicy. Under Welsh law, landowners and tenants alike might owe dues to their lords, abbots, or kings, and not just in coin. A specified number of cheese wheels per season was a common requirement, especially during the summer and autumn months. It was called a cheese render, and it was taken as seriously as a military levy. Fail to deliver? You might face fines, loss of grazing rights, or public embarrassment. Deliver too much, like a surprise gift of extra wheels? Now that was a political move. An attempt to gain favor. Sometimes, cheese was the medieval version of schmoozing. One delicious story buried in a 13th century tract describes a minor noble trying to gain a bishop's favor by delivering a cartload of aged cheese without worms or lies. The phrase makes you smile. You imagine the bishop sniffing the gift, nodding once, and granting a tiny land lease extension. Cheese diplomacy, subtle but effective. This tax-based system also meant that cheese sometimes backed up in storage. Monasteries might end up with too many wheels to eat, leading to charitable distributions or trade with traveling merchants. These surplus cheeses, often still marked with a maker's stamp, wound up in taverns, ships, or even foreign ports, spreading Welsh flavors far beyond their origins. And yes, there's a quirky outlier here: smuggled cheese. Certain cheese types, especially flavored or herb-studded varieties, were technically illegal to sell in some markets without permission. The reasoning? They were considered medicinal or ritually distinct. But people love loopholes. So some traders hid their spicy wheels under layers of plain curds, hoping the market reeve wouldn't slice too deep. You can almost see it, a cloaked figure slipping a pungent, pepper-laced wedge into a monk's satchel, whispering, "For your digestion, father." The monk nods. The cheese disappears. Even today, some cheese styles associated with Wales show trace evidence of those early black market trades: odd flavorings, ash-dusted rinds, herbal stripes no one can quite explain. Leftovers from a world where selling the wrong cheese in the wrong place might get you fined, flogged, or just very politely exiled from the cheese guild. Yes, there were cheese guilds. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You leave the market now, your basket full, your hands cold, your heart oddly full. You've seen cheese traded like coin, defended like kin, and judged like gold. You've watched laws rise and fall around humble wheels wrapped in linen. And you're only halfway through the tale. The fire in your mind cradle dims, glowing low and deep like an ember under ash. You roll gently into the next curve of the dream, past bustling marketplaces and legal wranglings, into a space just as lively, the kitchen. But not your average cottage kitchen. No enamel cookware here. No sourdough starter in a trendy jar. Tonight, you step into the cheese kitchens of medieval Wales, where women rule, tools are sacred, and making cheese isn't just a job, it's a ritual. You blink and find yourself barefoot on hard-packed clay, warm from the coals nearby. The air is heavy with steam and milk and the tang of sour whey drying in the corners. Your host, let's call her Anwen, gestures for you to mind the cats. They love cheese scraps, but get in the way of the curdling pans. Now, here's something your sleepy brain might not expect. In much of medieval Wales, cheesemaking was women's work. Not exclusively, but traditionally and widely. It fell under the broader category of household production tasks governed by female knowledge, like weaving, brewing, and herbal care. And while law codes often named men as landholders, it was the women who controlled the rhythm of food preservation, especially cheese. Historians still argue whether this control gave women more legal power or simply more responsibility. But in practice, it meant women were the ones who knew the difference between a sweet curd and a curd gone slimy, between a good thistle rennet and a lazy one. And in a culture where cheese could function as dowry, tax, gift, or proof of inheritance, that knowledge mattered. Anwen's got a system. First, the morning's milk, still warm from the udder, gets poured into a shallow, broad copper pan. She stirs in rennet. Not from a bottle, but scraped from a dried sheep's stomach, rinsed and soaked with a touch of cider. You wince. She laughs. You'd rather drink it than smell it, she teases. She's not wrong. Once the curds form, she lifts them gently, using a slotted wooden scoop that's been passed down 3 generations. The tool is burnished with use, the wood rich with oil and thyme. It's almost talismanic. She presses the curds into a rough cloth-lined mold, a wooden ring, no top or bottom, resting on a sloped board so the whey runs off. A flat stone goes on top. You watch as she sings under her breath, a low, rhythmic tune, almost hypnotic. This isn't a performance. It's how she times the turning. 1 verse per side. 3 verses, then check for firmness. Cheese as song. Cheese as heartbeat. And this isn't just aesthetic. The oral knowledge system in these kitchens passed down techniques with no recipes, no thermometers, no written instructions. If the curd breaks like a summer cloud, it's ready, one proverb goes. Another warns, if your shadow's long on the way, the batch will be bitter. Translation: don't start cheese too late in the day. One quirky practice involves using wool threads to cut curds. Not because they didn't have knives, they had plenty, but because the soft tension of the thread made for a cleaner cut, preserving curd structure. Plus, it was easier to clean. Imagine winding wool around your hands and gently slicing through a pale sea of milk jelly. Quietly satisfying, isn't it? But cheesemaking wasn't just housework, it was a social event. Especially during summer cheese season, when surplus milk demanded immediate processing. Neighboring women might gather for a full day of boiling, pressing, singing, and gossiping. They'd help each other turn wheels, salt the rinds, and swap techniques. One woman swears by nettle brine. Another hides a clove of garlic inside each mold to chase away bad humors. And yes, children were involved. Little ones were given jobs like skimming cream or pressing curds with clean stones. It was messy work, but it taught them early. You didn't learn cheesemaking from a book. You learned it by watching, touching, tasting, and occasionally ruining a batch so badly it had to be fed to the pigs. Anwen shows you the cheese log. Not an actual log. A mental one. She keeps track of each wheel by carving a single notch on a hanging stick for every turn or brining session. One stick per batch. The longer the stick, the more mature the wheel. Think of it as medieval version control. There's one wheel in her pantry, dark, dry, and tucked into a wooden box lined with juniper bark. She hasn't touched it in months. For Gwen's wedding, she says softly. Her daughter. The cheese will be sliced and served between toasts and dancing, maybe even packed into the marriage chest as part of her dowry. Dowry cheeses were real and significant. In some cases, a bride's value was calculated in livestock, tools, and wheels of aged cheese. Not only did this represent the woman's productive capacity, proof she could manage a household, but it also offered literal sustenance for the new couple. A good dowry cheese might feed guests, pay labourers, or serve as trade goods for the first few hungry months. And get this, cheese curses were a thing. If someone suspected their cheese had been sabotaged, spoiled on purpose, or hexed, they might consult a local herbalist or wise woman. Remedies varied. Some buried the bad batch under a rowan tree. Others burned dried sage over it while chanting. One folk remedy involved sticking pins into the rind and burying it under the threshold of the suspected wrongdoer. Cheese revenge, quiet, moldy, and incredibly passive-aggressive. But for every rotten wheel, there were 20 that turned out perfect. Tangy, nutty, creamy. Perfect for eating on oatcakes or melting into leeks. Anwen slices a piece for you, offers it with a smile. You helped, she says. You didn't, really, but in dreams, everything counts. You chew slowly. It's sharp and smooth, like sunshine stored in food form. You feel the warmth behind your eyes, the lull of fire and steam. These kitchens weren't just food factories. They were places of female knowledge, shared work, and quiet authority. And every wheel that left a cottage like Anwen's carried a story with it. You taste it now, that story. Salted, pressed, and lovingly turned. Your dream drifts again, soft as curd in whey. The kitchen fades. The warm cheese, the women's laughter, the cats licking scraps from the floor all dissolve into mist. Now, you're stepping outside once more, but this time the world feels larger. Grander. Political. Because cheese, as you're coming to realize, wasn't just food. It could climb all the way up the social ladder. Tonight, you trace how humble dairy curds found their way into the halls of power, shaping alliances, oaths, and even betrayals in the murky world of medieval Welsh politics. It starts small, of course. Always small. You imagine a minor landowner, perhaps called Murig ap Huel, sending 2 wheels of sheep cheese to a visiting noble. Not as payment, but as a gesture. A look what my land can do kind of moment. The cheese is fine, sharp, wrapped in ash and brined nettles. It arrives fresh and beautiful, despite being carried over 3 ridges and a river. The noble, let's call him Lord Cadfan, tastes it. Smiles. The next week, Murig receives permission to graze 5 more sheep on common land. Coincidence? Possibly. But in medieval Wales, where society ran not just on laws but on favours and kin networks, these little gifts could shape a life. And cheese, in particular, was a powerful form of soft diplomacy. There's even a legal phrase for it, Sifnawyd Callan, exchange of hearts. It referred to symbolic gifts that created emotional bonds between givers and receivers. A wheel of cheese wrapped in clean linen and hand-delivered wasn't just a snack. It said, I trust you. I respect you. I want you to remember me next time you're dividing inheritance or picking a war ally. One document from the 12th century describes a noblewoman sending cheese with summer sent to a monk as a thank you for arbitrating a boundary dispute. It's described in almost poetic terms, alongside wine and honey cakes, like a bouquet of edible affection. Historians still argue whether this form of gift-giving carried legal weight or was just ceremonial, but what's clear is this. You couldn't be a serious political player in medieval Wales without knowing your cheese etiquette. You didn't want to give the wrong kind, for starters. A crumbly goat's cheese might signal poverty, or insult a guest expecting sheep's milk. A too young will could suggest haste. A dried-out rind might imply disrespect, or worse, that you were re-gifting. Yes, even in 1273, re-gifting was a social sin. And some cheeses were explicitly reserved for the highborn. Take Cause Era, a snow-white cheese made from a mixture of ewe's milk and a morning skimming of cream, aged just long enough to hold form but still melt on the tongue. It was luxurious, delicate, and reportedly served at feasts hosted by the princes of Gwynedd. You find yourself at one of these feasts now. The hall is smoky, full of roasted meats and flickering torches. Harpers play softly. You're seated low, on the edge of the gathering, watching as a silver dish of cheeses is passed down the table. The prince, likely Llewellyn ap Grufford himself, makes a point of offering a slice to his Norman guest before taking any himself. A sign of trust. Of parity. Cheese diplomacy. But it wasn't always soft power. Sometimes cheese was used in more strategic ways. In the 13th century, during one of the many skirmishes between Welsh principalities and English overlords, there's record of a border village sending cheese in the night to the garrison of a Welsh stronghold. Why? Not as tribute, but as a signal. The cheese, it turns out, was wrapped in bramble leaves rather than the usual ash, a prearranged sign that the English troops were about to cross the nearby river. That wheel of cheese may have saved lives. Or maybe it triggered an ambush. The documents disagree. Either way, it reminds you, in a world with few maps, no texting, and dangerous roads, cheese could carry messages if you knew how to read them. Some wheels were branded with sigils, others wrapped in signature herbs or pressed with woven patterns that marked clan identity. A cheese's shape, scent, and cover told a trained recipient more than just flavor. They could hint at alliances, intentions, or warnings. The real twist. Even clergy got involved. Monasteries across Wales were deeply entwined with cheese production and trade. They kept dairies, trained workers, and maintained records, meticulous logs of who sent cheese, when, and in what quantity. These were more than inventories. They were social ledgers. And sometimes, weaponized. In one notorious case, an abbey in Powys publicly refused to accept cheese from a local baron they considered morally unfit, essentially excommunicating him from the cheese circuit. He retaliated by cutting off water access to the abbey's fields. Petty. Deeply. Effective. Also yes. Cheese and power were tangled vines, winding around every level of society. Even marriages weren't safe. You recall from Section 8 that cheese could appear in dowries. But sometimes, it was used in premarital negotiations. One surviving contract from the early 14th century lists 3 wheels of spring curd, salted and sealed, as part of a bride's bridal proof, a test of household skill. If the cheese was well aged by the wedding date, the match went forward. If not, well, let's just say more than one engagement was softened and lost in the way. And you'd better believe the nobles noticed. Stories spread. A young woman who could deliver a flawless wheel at her betrothal gained quiet clout, especially if the groom's family was, shall we say, particular. Now, you might be wondering, was this obsession with cheese a uniquely Welsh phenomenon? Historians still argue whether the level of legal entanglement was distinct in Wales or simply better recorded. Certainly, other medieval societies valued dairy, but the sheer volume of explicit cheese clauses in Welsh law and the evidence of its use in diplomacy, espionage, and ceremony suggests a cultural emphasis that bordered on the sacred. You stir under your blanket, mind drowsy, vision dim. You've watched cheese walk the tightrope between affection and ambition. From kitchen to throne room. From wrapped wheel to whispered secret. It may seem silly now, but in the chaos of medieval politics, what you offered on your table mattered just as much as what you offered on the battlefield. And a good cheese. It could win you a favor. A bad one? Well, you might just find yourself eating alone. You're floating now, head tucked in soft pillows, deep in this warm cheese-scented dream. But before you curl too far into slumber, the mist clears just enough for one last turn into something less visible, yet deeply felt, ritual, symbolism, and superstition. Tonight, you enter the realm where cheese isn't food at all. It's magic. It's easy to forget, wrapped in our electric blankets and almond milk lattes, that medieval people lived in a world full of symbols. Life was precarious: birth, disease, harvest, war. So naturally, they wove meaning into anything stable and sensory. And few things were as stable, as daily, as loaded with texture and transformation as a wheel of cheese. You find yourself outside a stone farmhouse in early spring. Morning frost sparkles on the heather, and the first sheep's milk of the season is steaming in a clay jug. A woman, she might be the granddaughter of Anwen from earlier, kneels in the grass, whispering into the way. She scatters crumbs from last year's cheese onto the threshold of the barn. Why? Well, you're watching a kind of protection charm. In parts of medieval Wales, it was believed that feeding tiny bits of last year's cheese to the land at calving time would bless the animals and prevent milk blight, a kind of mysterious illness where cows would suddenly stop producing. These acts weren't just quaint, they were part of rural survival logic. Historians still argue whether such rituals were driven more by pagan folk tradition or early Christian reinterpretation. Either way, the cheese was the conduit, soft enough to mold, old enough to remember. In some households, a first cheese of the season was offered at the hearth fire as a thank you to household spirits, being sometimes called Tiwh Teg, the Welsh fair folk. It wasn't left out with cookies and milk like in modern tales. No, it was wrapped in a bit of cloth, tied with red thread, and tucked behind the fireplace stone. You can almost see it there, a humble offering for warmth and health. Even childbirth involved cheese. In some regions, a small wheel made from the first milk after lambing, rich, creamy, and symbolic of new life, would be placed near the birthing bed. Not to be eaten, just to sit, silently absorbing whatever tension or fear filled the air. If the cheese cracked during the labor, it was considered a bad omen. If it remained intact, it was thought to bring health and easy nursing. Quirky. Very. But the symbolism ran deep. Cheese as transformation, as resilience, as continuity across seasons and generations. And then there were the weddings. Remember Gwen's dowry cheese from Section 8? Turns out, that wasn't the only cheese involved. A common ritual included breaking a soft, fresh wheel over the threshold of the new home before the bride entered. The idea was to soften the house, to make it yielding, gentle, welcoming. Guests might grab a piece of the broken cheese for luck. Some brides even kept a slice under their pillow on the wedding night, because apparently cheese dreams were a thing long before Freud came along. And let's not forget the opposite end of the spectrum, funerals. One document from Carmarthenshire mentions a morning cheese, pressed and salted on the day of someone's death, then aged for 40 days. On the final day of mourning, it was sliced and shared with neighbours as a way of both honouring the dead and, frankly, making sure people came back around after the worst of the grief had passed. Cheese as social glue, even in sorrow. The idea of cheese absorbing emotion, grief, joy, fear was surprisingly widespread. That's probably why cheese was rarely thrown out, even when mold crept in. Instead, it might be buried, burned, or offered to animals. Waste wasn't just impractical. It was disrespectful to the memory or energy embedded in the food. One strange tidbit: some farmers believed that cheese could predict weather. You'd hang a fresh wheel in the doorway and watch it carefully. If it sweated before dawn, rain. If the rind cracked early, drought. If it squeaked when cut, snow. Of course, no modern meteorologist would endorse this, but hey, when the only thing more unreliable than the sky was your cousin Murig's oat harvest, you took your forecasts where you could get them. And yet, these beliefs weren't just idle superstition. They gave structure and narrative to daily life. Cheese marked time. It told stories. It connected the living to the dead, the known to the uncertain. You pause and think, isn't that what ritual is for? To give meaning to the things we can't control? There's one more image before the dream slides forward. A small village festival, midsummer. Bonfires flicker along the hills, and families gather in the open fields. Someone produces a trial cheese, a soft, grassy-smelling thing made from the milk of every household in the valley, mixed together and shaped into a communal wheel. It's cut with ceremony. First slice goes to the oldest grandmother. Second to the youngest child. Everyone eats, and as they chew, they recite little blessings, rhyming bits that say things like "May your sheep stay full and your curd never bitter." Sweet. Sleepy. Endearingly cheesy. This cheese doesn't last. It's too soft, too delicate. It's eaten right there, under the stars. But that's the point. It doesn't need to last. It's a moment, shared. And that moment becomes memory, folded into the year like curds into a mold. Even today, echoes remain. You might see it in a Welsh market cheese labelled with a saint's name, or hear it in an old proverb about milk without music curdling in the bowl. The magic hasn't gone. It's just quieter now. And in your dream, that cheese still sits behind the hearthstone, warm and humming with promise. The fire crackles low in your imagination now, shadows curling like ribbons across the floor of an old cottage. The scent of wool, herbs, and, yes, just a trace of sharp, aged cheese lingers in the air. You've wandered through the dairy barns, the law scrolls, the feast halls, and even the strange superstitions. But now the trail bends again, toward something quieter, but no less powerful. Tonight, you follow the cheese into the monastic world, where silence hums like a bell, and every action, even turning a wheel of curd, becomes a kind of devotion. It might surprise you, but Welsh monasteries in the medieval period weren't just places of prayer. They were deeply practical hubs, centers of knowledge, economy, medicine, and, yes, cheesemaking. Picture a stone abbey nestled in a green valley, bees droning lazily, smoke curling from a low chimney, and behind it, long lines of fenced pasture where sheep graze under careful watch. In the dairies of these monastic lands, cheese wasn't just a food. It was a sacred rhythm, a task repeated with precision and quiet reverence. Stir the curds, sing a psalm. Press the cheese, meditate on mortality. Age the wheels in stone cellars that echoed with a silence so deep, you could hear the milk shift inside. Why cheese, though? Why not just bread or ale? Because cheese, like monastic life itself, is about transformation. You take something raw and messy, milk, or maybe a soul, and through time, patience, and just the right pressure, you make it durable, structured, nourishing. The monks understood this. They lived it. And let's not forget, cheese kept well. In a world where fresh food spoiled fast, a sturdy wheel of monastery-aged ewe's milk cheese could last weeks. This made it perfect for almsgiving, one of the monks' sacred duties. A poor widow might come to the abbey gate and receive a small wedge wrapped in linen. Not just food, but sustenance gifted with dignity. Records from the 13th century show specific monks assigned as courser cheese stewards who tracked cheese inventory like it was scripture. And maybe it was. These inventories didn't just list how much cheese they had. They detailed who it came from, how it was aged, what it was meant for, sacred days, guests, travelers, or the poor. There was a rhythm to it. Fresh cheeses for pilgrims. Medium-aged for monks' daily meals. The finest aged wheels. Often saved for visiting bishops or exchanged with neighboring abbeys as tokens of goodwill. Monasteries didn't just consume cheese, they helped standardize it. In fact, historians still argue whether certain modern Welsh cheesemaking techniques, like the double pressing method for firmer texture, trace their roots to monastic dairies. The evidence is compelling. References to twice-handled curd and salted by the hours in old abbey documents suggest an almost scientific attention to the craft. And where there is science, there are experiments. Monks in northern Wales were known to flavour cheeses with wild herbs like marjoram, thyme, even juniper, and record the results. One surviving fragment from the Abbey of Strata, Florida, includes a cryptic note: June milk with goosegrass, more pleasing to the abbot than the last. Imagine a line of brown-robed monks taste-testing cheeses in a stone hall like medieval culinary judges. Gordon Ramsay would tremble in his boots. But cheese also had spiritual symbolism. In one Easter homily, a monk compares the resurrection to cheese rising from the curd, new form from old flesh, held fast by salt and spirit. It sounds odd now, but back then, metaphors grounded in everyday food made theology tangible. And what's more everyday than cheese? Cheese also crept into penance. In some monasteries, a monk who violated his vow of silence might be assigned to the dairy not as punishment, but as reform through rhythm. Cheesemaking required quiet hands, slow breath, attentive presence. A kind of edible mindfulness. Let the milk teach him, one abbot wrote. And sometimes, the cheesemaking itself became prayer. One odd record from a Carmelite priory describes a ritual where 3 monks would process cheese in silence while reciting portions of the Psalms. Each stage, cutting the curd, draining the whey, forming the mold, was matched with a verse. This was no accident. The daily work of the dairy became liturgy, a seamless blend of sacred and mundane. Not all was solemn, though. There's evidence that Cheese Day, the annual celebration of the first aged wheel of the season, was quite the event. Monks and lay brothers would gather in the cloister courtyard, sing, share bread and cheese, and even play simple games. One account refers to a cheese rolling competition down the abbey's hill. Apparently, even holy men couldn't resist watching their lunch go bouncing down a slope at terrifying speeds. But not all cheese stayed in the abbey. Monasteries were cheese exporters, too. Wealthier abbeys, especially those near trade routes, sold surplus cheese to local markets, noble houses, and even shipped it across borders. Welsh cheese, with its distinctive texture and herbal infusions, was highly prized by foreign visitors. One scribe traveling from France wrote that the white rounds of the monks of Cum her taste of meadow and smoke and virtue. High praise, if a bit flowery. Still, not every wheel was perfect. In a scandalous turn, one abbey in southeast Wales was accused in 1294 of watering down milk before curdling, leading to crumbly, bitter cheese. This was seen not just as bad business, but as moral failure. If your cheese was dishonest, what did that say about your prayers? Eventually, of course, monasteries fell to war and reform. Many were dissolved, their dairies repurposed or lost to time. But the legacy of monastic cheesemaking lives on in techniques, tastes, and the quiet idea that even the smallest acts, like turning a cheese on its shelf, can carry sacred weight. You stir gently under your covers. Maybe it's the warm milk from earlier, or just the weight of so many imagined cloisters, but your thoughts feel slow and golden now. Like the gentle blooming of a rind in a dark, silent cellar. Still. Ancient. Perfect. And as you drift further, you wonder what small part of your own life could be like that cheese. Transformed not with noise or speed, but with patience, quiet, and care. You're lying in the long shadow of the abbey now, its stone walls faded into memory, and you drift gently down the winding path to the marketplace, where sacred meets rowdy, and wheels of cheese don't pray, they haggle. Welcome to the lively, sweaty, gloriously chaotic world of Welsh cheese commerce. The sun is already warm as you step into the heart of a bustling medieval town square. Wooden stalls line the lanes, chickens strut beneath wagons, and someone's definitely trying to sell you a pig that looks suspiciously like yesterday's pig, just washed. But your eyes are on something else, round, waxy, a little misshapen. Cheese. Lots of it. Dozens of varieties, each one shaped not just by recipe, but by region, identity, and deeply personal pride. In medieval Wales, market days were serious business. Villages might only host official cheese trading 2 or 3 times a year, and when they did, people traveled from miles away, sometimes on foot, sometimes in creaking carts pulled by donkeys or shaggy ponies, and always carrying cheese. Not just to buy it, but to sell, barter, or flaunt it. Cheese wasn't just a product. It was currency, reputation, and sometimes weaponized ego. A well-aged ewe's milk wheel from the valleys of Powys could be worth several chickens or a bolt of good linen. A firmer, travel-hardened cow's milk cheese from the Wye region might fetch enough to pay a family's harvest tax. Some sellers waxed their cheese in decorative patterns, others tied colored threads around them, early branding, really. If you sold cheese at the summer fair and nobody remembered your stall, well, that was worse than losing your sheep. And because of this, the rules around cheese sales were robust. The laws of Hywel Dda, ever practical, established very specific expectations. Cheese sold must be of honest weight, without worms or unjust salt, and this part's oddly specific, not mixed with ashes. You get the sense someone, somewhere, really ruined it for everyone. Punishments for cheating? Fines, public shaming, or being banned from the next market altogether. In an age before Yelp, reputation was all you had. If word spread that you'd watered down your curd or rushed your aging, you might as well pack up your stall and start selling turnips instead. And this wasn't a free-for-all, either. Guilds began to form, not unlike trade unions today, made up of cheesemakers who swore to uphold certain standards. Membership wasn't automatic. You had to prove your skill, often by submitting sample wheels for inspection. It's unclear exactly how this worked, but you can imagine a table of stern-faced guild elders, noses buried deep in wedges of pungent blue cheese, declaring judgment like culinary druids. Historians still argue whether these guilds were mostly male, or if women, who did much of the dairy work, also had seats at the table. There's scattered evidence suggesting that milkmaids of skill were granted trading rights equal to their male counterparts in some regions, especially in the Western Hills, where the cheese was often made and sold by the same hands. And then there were the cheese taxes. Oh yes. Where there's profit, there's always a king with a hand out. Depending on where you were, a portion of your cheese sales might go directly to a local lord, a bishop, or even the crown. Sometimes it was taken in coin. Sometimes in actual cheese, stored in great cool halls known as taikors, cheese houses, until it could be redistributed to soldiers, nobles, or as political gifts. Imagine trying to win over a rival prince not with gold, but with a magnificent wheel of smoked goat cheese from the Black Mountains. That's diplomacy, dairy style. One particularly strange tidbit. In some markets, cheese had to be sung in before sale. Yes, sung. A local bard or town crier would step onto a box, clear his throat, and literally announce the arrival of notable cheesemakers and their wares in rhyme or chant. Something like, "From the hills of Green Raider comes Gwen with curds that gladden her." Quirky. Absolutely. But also incredibly effective. People remembered what they could hum. Of course, not everyone played fair. There were cheese forgeries. Some traders, especially during hard years, would try to pass off cow's milk cheese as richer used milk by adding extra salt and coloring the rind with browned herbs or even crushed root dye. And if you think food fraud is a modern invention, think again. One court record describes a cheese maker being flogged for curd dishonesty. That's probably not a phrase you ever expected to hear in your life, but here we are. Despite the competition, market days were also moments of connection. Neighboring families swapped gossip while sampling aged wheels. Children played games nearby. One popular one involved rolling small cheese rounds like wheels and seeing whose went furthest without toppling. In lean years, merchants might quietly give a wedge to a struggling neighbor or trade with the baker for tomorrow's bread. And in the midst of all this commerce, festivals. Every major market had its cheese games. Speed-turning competitions, who could flip and salt curds the fastest, blind taste tests, even a bizarre event called the milk bucket race, where competitors balanced a sloshing pail on their heads while being chased by someone in a goat costume. Was this sacred? No. Was it amazing? Deeply. But perhaps most beloved of all were the cheese auctions, where prized wheels, sometimes aged for years, were sold to the highest bidder amid raucous cheers. One wheel from Denbighshire reportedly sold for the price of a silver brooch. People would save all year just for a sliver of something that reminded them of home, or of a grandmother long gone. And just like that, the sun dips behind the market stalls. Merchants pack up their wheels in straw-lined baskets, and the last buyers drift off, cheese tucked under their arms like treasure. You feel it too, that soft satisfaction of trade well made, of people connecting through something humble and handmade. You take a final breath in this dream, scented with hay, sweat, and something sharp, and you can almost hear the crier's voice as it fades. Good cheese to all, and to all a good bite. The market din fades into night now, the chatter of buyers replaced by crickets and creaking wooden doors drawn shut. But you, ever curious, don't sleep just yet. You slip through time again, into something more abstract, more invisible but potent, the web of power that cheese quietly helped weave. Tonight, you're wandering into the strange corridors of cheese diplomacy and symbolic wealth in medieval Wales, because believe it or not, wheels of curd had a way of rolling their way into politics, alliances, and displays of social dominance. Let's begin with the obvious. Medieval Welsh nobility loved a good feast. And you already know what was at the heart of those banquet tables: cheese, of course. But not just any cheese. Not something your cousin's neighbor made last week and stored under a leaky eave. No, the cheese presented at noble tables was a statement. A signal. A declaration in curd. A dense, aged cheese from upland sheep, wrapped in wax and rubbed with herbs from a mountainside monastery, sent a message: we're refined. We're connected. We have taste and time. It wasn't flashy like gold, but it had its own social shine. In a time before email, business cards, or curated Instagram feeds, what you served or gifted said everything. We have records of land disputes settled over cheese gifts. In one border skirmish between rival Welsh clans in the 1200s, a peace agreement was sealed with the exchange of livestock, a cart of wool, and get this, 6 wheels of honey-washed cheese aged 3 years in an abbey near Llandeilo. That cheese wasn't just food. It was proof of maturity, patience, and value. Some historians argue whether these cheese exchanges had more weight than we realize. Were they symbolic tokens? Soft power plays? Early forms of culinary diplomacy? The evidence is hazy, but there's enough parchment, enough whispers, to suggest that in the right hands, cheese became a political tool. And don't forget the role of cheese in dowries and inheritances. Yes, really. A noblewoman marrying into another clan might carry with her not just jewelry or land deeds, but a carefully packed collection of cheeses, some fresh, some aged. These weren't just snacks for the road. They were family signatures in dairy form, passed on like edible heirlooms. To accept someone's cheese was, in a way, to accept their culture, their standing, their taste. Imagine a new bride arriving at her husband's hall, opening a straw-lined crate, and unveiling her family's prized herb-aged cheese. It says, "My people are generous. My kitchen is skilled. We age our milk with care and intention. We belong here." And the reverse was also true. If a noble house served spoiled or bland cheese at a feast, it could be taken as an insult, or worse, a sign of internal disorder. One 13th century poem mocks a rival chieftain for his cheese dry as a hedge root, with more squeak than song. That's not just culinary shade, that's a full medieval roast, dairy edition. Of course, not every cheese-based exchange was noble. Some were downright shady. In times of famine or political instability, cheese became a black market commodity. Monastic cheeses, forbidden from private sale, would be quietly traded under the table. Aging wheels stolen from abbey stores might end up in the kitchens of less scrupulous lords. One murky account tells of a smuggler who was caught with 30 wheels of blessed cheese from a Carmelite storehouse, trying to trade them for iron tools across the English border. His fate? Lost to history. Probably not great. But cheese also moved across borders peacefully, especially in moments of alliance. Welsh rulers would send cheese to English or Irish nobles as gifts along with textiles, mead, or falcons. These weren't bribes exactly, but tokens of respect, sent with elaborate care. The cheeses would be packed in wood or ceramic, wrapped in herbs to preserve them, and sometimes marked with house seals pressed into the rind, literal edible crests. Think about that for a second. A wheel of cheese, inscribed with a family symbol, sent across kingdoms. You don't slice into that casually. You consider it. You interpret it. Cheese, in this sense, was language. And not just political language. Spiritual language, too. Some noble families would commission ritual cheeses blessed by monks, aged for a specific holy number of days, 40 was popular, and given to allies or vassals as a kind of edible talisman. Eating it was believed to bring health, clarity, or even protection in battle. These weren't cheeses for chewing over idle gossip. These were sacred dairy relics. And then there were cheese curses. Yes, you heard that right. Some records, half folkloric, half legal, describe cheeses being hexed before being gifted to enemies. A cheese rubbed with bitter herbs, or aged in cursed wood, might be slipped into an enemy's feast. This wasn't about poison, usually, it was symbolic. A way to send a message, this gift comes with strings attached. Sort of like subtweeting in cheese. There's even a tale of one nobleman who dreamt that the cheese he'd accepted as a peace gift had been aged near the bones of a traitor. He threw the whole wheel into a river at dawn. Superstitious? Yes. But in a world where meaning lived in every object, nothing was just food. You shift a little under your covers, your mind flooded with images, a diplomat bowing as he unwraps a carefully aged wheel, a bride tucking cheese into her dowry chest, a monk sealing a sacred wedge with wax and prayer. It's absurd and intimate and strangely profound. Because behind all the rules and rituals, you start to feel the core truth. Cheese, in medieval Wales, was trust. It took time to make, longer to age, and care to share. It couldn't be rushed, faked, well, not successfully, or mass-produced. It was local, specific, intentionally personal. And so, in a time before signatures, before banknotes, before even surnames had fully settled in, a good wheel of cheese could say what 1,000 words never could. Now, the night draws nearer. You're warm under imaginary furs, full on metaphorical mead and cheese, and you feel something tender about it all. How even the smallest gifts, carefully shaped and lovingly shared, could hold kingdoms together for just a little while longer. You've wandered through abbeys and markets, danced with laws and legends, and now, slowly, you step into quieter fields, the land itself humming beneath your feet. Because long before cheese made its way to royal tables or monastic inventories, it began here, in soil, grass, and weather. Tonight, you tilt your head back and feel the weight of Welsh air, damp, fragrant, and wildly alive. Welcome to the geography of flavor, where the landscape itself writes the recipe. It starts with the grass. The pastures of medieval Wales weren't uniform plains. They were stitched together like a patchwork quilt, wild herbs here, boggy moss there, with stretches of wind-beaten hilltops and valleys lined with clover and wild garlic. And that meant no two cows, sheep, or goats grazed the same meal. The milk they gave, infused with those differences. The cheese, a time capsule of terrain. Modern cheesemongers call this terroir, the way the land shapes taste, but medieval Welsh farmers simply called it life. You graze where you can, you milk what grazes, and you use what you've got. Sometimes that meant your cheese tasted like sunshine and time. Other times, like smoke, rain, and pure defiance. And what a rugged land it was. In the craggy north, near Snowdonia, Highland sheep produced small amounts of rich milk, perfect for dense, hard cheeses that could withstand long winters. Meanwhile, in the softer, wetter lowlands of the south, cows gave creamier yields, leading to cheeses more supple and fast-aging. The climate dictated everything, and the people adjusted accordingly, not out of romance, but necessity. You might not expect it, but goats thrived in rocky coastal outcrops, their milk turning into tangy, bright cheeses often wrapped in leaves for aging. One coastal legend tells of a cheesemaker who flavored his wheels with dried seaweed for salt, an innovation now seen as modern, but back then, simply resourceful. Yet, despite the natural variety, the laws of Huel Dada tried to keep some order. Specific regions were known for specific types of cheese, and landowners were taxed or rewarded accordingly. A man with a Highland holding producing subpar ewe milk cheese? He could be fined. A valley farm exceeding expectations? Well, he might get extra grazing rights next season. It was all in the ground. But not everyone agreed on how much it mattered. Historians still debate whether these geographic distinctions were formalized or just understood. Did markets enforce regional labeling? Or was it all word of mouth, don't buy from that one, his sheep graze on bitter marsh sort of deal? We do know that certain place names became synonymous with quality. Tywee, Caerdigion, and Meirionnydd crop up again and again in trade documents and poetry alike, their names shorthand for creamy, trustworthy cheese. One bard even called the cheese of Brecknockshire as golden as dawn on a saint's eyebrow, which is either a compliment or a very weird way to say it's aged well. The tools used also mirrored the terrain. In rocky areas, cheese presses were carved from local slate. In wooded zones, they might be shaped from ash or hazel. Some presses were passed down generations, literal family heirlooms that bore not just curd, but memory. You can picture a grandmother teaching her granddaughter how to pack curd into a stone mold, whispering secrets about when to flip, when to wait, when to leave it be. The process wasn't written down, it was felt. The storage spaces, too, were shaped by geography. Natural caves were used as cool aging chambers in the hills. In coastal zones, underground pits lined with sea-smoothed stones held wheels chilled by damp wind and tide-pulled air. Every cheese was a story of where it had been and where it would return. Sometimes literally. Because cheese didn't just leave the land. It came back. As tribute. As tax. As proof. A shepherd might be required to give 5 wheels a season to his local lord. In return, he kept his grazing rights. That cheese aged, wrapped, and delivered would then travel through the social system, but it always traced its way back to the hillside it came from. And people knew. You couldn't fake a river valley cheese in a mountaintop wheel. Well, you could try, but the taste would betray you. And possibly get you fined. Or mocked in a very pointed folk song. And then there was seasonality. Spring cheeses, light, fresh, herbaceous, were often consumed quickly. Summer cheeses, made with richer milk, were stored longer. But the prized wheels. Autumn cheeses, thickened by end-of-season grass, with just enough aging time to ripen by midwinter. These were your celebratory cheeses, your winter feast stars, your no, you can't have another slice until your cheeses. Some families would even bury their finest wheels in marked soil hollows, returning months later to uncover what they hoped had become edible treasure. And yes, there were losses. Mold, moisture, theft by foxes or less moral neighbors. But the potential reward. A bite of something made when the world was still golden. One fringe theory suggests that in certain parts of northwestern Wales, cheese was used to map land ownership, each valley's output being so distinct that a single bite could prove where a disputed patch belonged. It sounds romantic. It's almost certainly exaggerated. But it's just plausible enough to make you smile in the dark. And finally, there's the silence. Because long after the cheese is eaten, the trade done, and the song sung, the land remains. The same rain that fed medieval cows still falls. The same wind that whipped curds dry still rustles old hedgerows. And if you ever find yourself on a quiet hillside in Wales, kneeling near the stone ruins of an old farmstead, you might still feel it, the faint echo of curd draining into woven baskets, of a hand pressing gently into fresh, warm cheese, trusting the land to do its work. The truth is, you can't talk about Welsh cheese without talking about Welsh land. The two are inextricable. Interwoven. A bite of cheese wasn't just a food, it was a landscape, condensed. And now, as you close your eyes, you're lying not in a bed, but in a field beneath the stars, wrapped in bramble-scented air. There's cheese cooling in a cave nearby, a ewe resting quietly beside you, and the earth feels older than history itself. You're nearing the edge now, not just of the tale, but of time itself. The fire's almost out, the stories are fading to embers, and somewhere deep in the valley, a dog barks once, then falls silent. Tonight's last steps lead you to the slow unraveling of cheese lore, and how, like all great things, it didn't exactly end. It evolved, softened by centuries of change. By the late medieval period, the meticulous cheese rules carved into Hywel Dada's law codes had begun to erode not out of disinterest, but because the world had changed too fast for curd to keep up. You're walking now through a village in the early 1400s, and things already feel different. There's still cheese, of course. Still cows and sheep and goats chewing thoughtfully on whatever's left of last month's greenery. But the rules, the finely graded cheese taxes and noble-specific milk rights, they're growing fuzzy around the edges. Why? Blame a few things. First, the Black Death. It didn't just kill people. It shattered social systems. Fields went untended, herds vanished, monks died in their beds, and the careful balance of dairy labor collapsed. With fewer mouths to feed and fewer hands to milk them, cheese production took a nosedive, and with it, many of the laws governing it. Then came the rise of English influence, especially after the laws in Wales Acts of the 1530s and 1540s. These acts effectively annexed Wales into the Kingdom of England, wiping away many of the legal customs that had defined Welsh life, including the detailed food laws. Cheesemaking didn't stop, but the legal reverence for it, gone. Suddenly, Welsh cheese wasn't part of a noble contract, it was just food. Useful, yes. Delicious, often. But no longer a line item in political documents or a court case waiting to happen. You could say cheese lost its power. Or maybe it just slipped quietly underground, like a will wrapped in linen and buried for aging. Still, not everyone let go. In small, stubborn corners of the countryside, some traditions held on not because anyone enforced them, but because they still worked. Families continued to follow unwritten guidelines about curd timing, milk mixing, and herb pairing. Oral traditions replaced parchments. Grandparents taught grandkids when to salt and how to spot a bad batch just by smell. Cheesemaking remained sacred not by law, but by love. And that's when a funny thing began to happen. Cheese became identity. With no laws left to bind it, cheese became a cultural emblem. The English had cheddar, the French had brie, and the Welsh? They had what remained regional recipes, family methods, ghost stories of cursed wheels and divine aging. There's a sense that people clung harder to their cheese not despite the absence of law, but because of it. Like a language outlawed, only to thrive in whispered songs and kitchen rituals. And it didn't stay sleepy forever. Fast forward to the 20th century, your modern time, and there's a full revival. Artisans begin digging through history. Cheese historians, yes, they exist, start unearthing references in dusty court rolls and bardic verses. Local producers recreate ancient styles. Traditional Welsh cheese becomes a label again, stamped with pride. A lawless legacy, born anew in the supermarket aisle. Take Caerphilly, now Wales's most famous cheese. Originally a miner's snack, crumbly, tangy, and fast to mature, it's now a flag-bearer of Welsh heritage. But historians argue whether it was truly Welsh in origin, or a Victorian English invention retrofitted to nostalgia. As always, nothing is simple. And cheese? Least of all. You're in the present now, standing in a kitchen with your phone light casting soft shadows on a cutting board. On it, a wedge of something aged and flecked with chive, maybe handmade by someone whose great-great-grandmother whispered a blessing over her curds. You take a bite. It's good. Better than good, it tastes like hills and smoke and something just out of memory's reach. You realize, gently, that laws aren't the only way to preserve meaning. Sometimes it's taste that does it. Or scent. Or tradition so old it forgets where it came from. And in that way, the medieval laws didn't disappear. They melted, slow and quiet, into culture, into story, into cheese that still carries traces of a time when a missing vat of curd could cause a full-blown legal crisis. The lines between rule and ritual blur, like warm brie on a summer plate. And that's the beauty of it, isn't it? You've wandered through feasts and fields, abbeys and courtrooms, and discovered that what seems small, a lump of curd, a wooden press, a law about who gets the first scoop, is actually enormous. It's about trust, power, family, geography, and most of all, care. Because you don't make good cheese accidentally. And no one, especially not in medieval Wales, wrote pages of law about something they didn't take seriously. So tonight, as the last words curl around your ears and the final crumbs settle, remember this. In a world of chaos and conquest, where kings fall and borders blur, a simple, salted wheel of cheese once stood for order. For balance. For something that mattered. And maybe, just maybe, It still does. So now, let's slow everything down. The last hoofbeat has faded into moss. The last clink of a dairy bell has drifted away on mist. All that's left is you, and the hush of a story settling into the corners of the room. The night stretches wide above you, sky wrapped in velvet and laced with distant stars. In your mind's hand, you're holding a small, round wheel, soft, cool, and humble. No label. No barcode. Just time and patience made solid. You feel the weight of it. You remember where it came from. It came from women whispering over curdled milk. From men drawing boundaries with cheese knives. From monks scribbling inventory and bandits eyeing lunch. From valleys that smelled of thyme and wet wool, and from hilltops where goats cried into the wind. It came from centuries of people who, despite war and famine and laws both cruel and kind, kept making cheese anyway. Because something in them knew, it's not just food. It's memory. And now it's yours. So let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift like cream rising in stillness. Picture that quiet dairy cellar again, cool stone, the soft clink of aging tools, and a single candle burning low. No need to move. No need to speak. The story's been told. The cheese has aged. The laws have crumbled into legend. And you've arrived at the softest part of the tale. The place where everything holds, and nothing demands. Good night, traveler of curds and kings. Sleep deep. Sleep kind. Sleep cheesy.